June 10, 2025. As the sun sets over the razor-wire silhouette of Florida State Prison, the clock ticks toward a moment nearly 3 decades in the making. At the heart of it is Anthony F. Wainwright, a man whose name has lingered in the court records and memories of a small Florida town since the spring of 1994. Now 54 years old, he waits behind concrete and steel for the state to end his life by lethal injection. But this story isn't just about an execution. It's about a chilling journey that began with a prison break and ended with the murder of a young woman, the unraveling of a fugitive's path across the American South, and the silence that followed him into death row. What began as an escape turned into a crime that would shake a community, define a courtroom, and echo through time as one of the most harrowing murder cases Florida has ever seen. Tonight, we follow the trail left behind, through violence, grief, and justice delayed, for the final chapter in a case that refuses to fade away. Long before the prison bars and execution date, Anthony Fletcher Wainwright was just another child growing up in the rural backroads of North Carolina. Born in 1970, he came into a world shaped by poverty, instability, and silence, where broken homes and generational hardship were more common than hope. The records don't tell us much about his early days, but what they do reveal paints a bleak picture. A boy raised in the shadows, surrounded by trouble he neither created nor escaped. Was anyone listening when the signs began to appear? The arrest for theft before his 16th birthday. The school fights. The juvenile detentions. The psychiatric assessments that hinted at deep emotional fracture. By the late 1980s, Wainwright had begun to move between courtrooms and jail cells with the kind of ease that only comes from familiarity. Armed robbery would land him in a North Carolina correctional facility in the early 1990s, but even then the sense of finality never stuck. There was restlessness in him. A quiet, relentless energy building behind cold eyes. May 1994. Somewhere deep inside the walls of a North Carolina correctional facility, Anthony Wainwright made a decision that would change more than just his own life. With calculated resolve, he slipped away from custody, escaping the confinement that had held him since his conviction for armed robbery. How he did it remains a detail buried in court documents and guarded memories, but what's clear is that once free, he didn't look back. He crossed state lines into Georgia, hitching rides and staying hidden, before finally slipping into northern Florida. It was there, in Lake City, that his path crossed with someone who had no idea what was coming. May 11th. A quiet Wednesday afternoon. 23-year-old Carmen Gayheart, a mother, daughter, and fiancée, was going about her day in the Winn-Dixie parking lot. She had plans, errands, and a life waiting for her. But in broad daylight, Anthony Wainwright approached her, brandishing a gun, and forced her into her own vehicle. Witnesses later recalled a brief commotion. A door slammed. Tires screeched. And then she was gone. Over the next several hours, Wainwright drove Carmen across county lines. Law enforcement would later piece together a grim sequence of events. She was sexually assaulted, likely under threat of death. Somewhere along a wooded stretch off a remote road, he brought the car to a stop. What did she say in those final moments? Did she plead for her life? Was she promised she'd be let go? We may never know. What we do know is this: Anthony Wainwright pulled the trigger. A single shot to the head. He left Carmen's body in the woods and drove off in her car, abandoning not just a crime scene but a young woman's future. It wasn't just murder. It was calculated, brutal, and cold. With Carmen Gayhart's lifeless body found discarded in the woods and her stolen vehicle now missing, authorities launched what quickly became a multi-state manhunt. Anthony Wainwright wasn't just another escaped inmate anymore. He was a murder suspect, armed, dangerous, and on the move. Across 3 states, North Carolina, Georgia, and Florida, highway patrol units, local sheriffs, and federal agents scrambled to coordinate. His movements were erratic, unpredictable, and that made him more dangerous. He wasn't using his real name. He had no fixed route. He traveled back roads, lived out of stolen vehicles, paid in cash, and left little behind. Yet, investigators had something else, a pattern. At every stop, every gas station, every sighting, there were whispers. Anonymous tips from people who swore they saw a thin, quiet man matching his description. In some towns he'd posed as a drifter, in others a mechanic looking for work. But his time was running out. The break came when a call came in from Vicksburg, Mississippi, over 500 miles from Lake City. A motel clerk reported a suspicious guest who checked in under a false name and never left the room during the day. Law enforcement moved quickly. By then, the Florida Department of Law Enforcement had circulated Wainwright's fugitive profile to every law enforcement agency within 1,000 miles. Officers traced the license plate on the vehicle in the parking lot. It was Carmen Gayhart's. May 13, 1994. Just 2 days after Carmen's death, the parking lot of a small two-star motel off a quiet highway became the scene of Wainwright's final stand. Officers from multiple jurisdictions surrounded the building in silence, their guns drawn, fingers curled around triggers, adrenaline pounding. There was no negotiation. No drawn-out standoff. What happened next was fast, violent, and unpredictable. When officers moved to breach the room, gunfire erupted. Witnesses described hearing a volley of shots, sharp, rapid, terrifying. Windows shattered. Officers shouted commands through the chaos. Wainwright didn't surrender. He fought. He fired. But the fight ended quickly. He was shot and subdued by law enforcement. The gun slipped from his hand. Blood pooled at his side. In less than 3 minutes, the man who had eluded police across 3 states lay on the cold floor of a Mississippi motel room, breathing but defeated. He was cuffed, searched, and transported to a nearby hospital under heavy guard. The weapon recovered at the scene was later matched to the bullet that killed Carmen. But it wasn't just a weapon they found. Inside Carmen's vehicle and Wainwright's belongings were the remnants of a stolen life. Her personal effects, purse, wallet, a child's toy from her backseat, and, chillingly, her engagement ring, were collected and logged as evidence. Some of these items would never be returned to her family. Others would be sealed in plastic bags, archived as exhibits, forever connected to a case that was only beginning its journey through the courts. Wainwright's mugshot was taken that night. In it he appears pale, unshaven, eyes sunken. His shirt stained with blood. His face unreadable. There was no sign of remorse. No visible trace of fear. Just a blank expression, hardened by years of incarceration and a crime spree that had just brought his freedom to a violent, final end. News of the capture broke fast. By morning, his photo was on the front page of every newspaper across Florida and Mississippi. For some, it was relief. For others, especially the Gayheart family, it marked the beginning of an emotional and legal journey that would stretch on for decades. Though the man who had taken Carmen's life was finally in custody, for her loved ones, justice still felt painfully out of reach. After the gunfire quieted in Mississippi and the cuffs were tightened on Anthony Wainwright's wrists, the next phase began, not just for him, but for the entire community shattered by the loss of Carmen Gayheart. Wainwright was medically treated for his injuries, held in a Mississippi detention center under heavy guard, and eventually extradited back to Florida. There in Hamilton County, just miles from the wooded stretch where Carmen's life ended, he would stand trial for one of the most brutal crimes the region had ever witnessed. The charges were swift and sweeping: first-degree murder, sexual battery, armed robbery, and kidnapping. Prosecutors prepared a case with a clear narrative, one that didn't leave much room for ambiguity. The physical evidence was overwhelming. Forensic matches. Carmen's belongings recovered from the stolen Bronco. The murder weapon. And the testimony of Richard Hamilton, Wainwright's co-defendant, who described in chilling detail what happened that day. Courtroom observers described the atmosphere as tense and emotionally charged. Carmen's family filled the front rows, their faces locked on the man accused of taking their daughter. The prosecution painted Wainwright as a dangerous and remorseless predator. In their version, this wasn't a crime of passion or desperation. It was coldly calculated. Carmen had begged for her life, they said. She had endured hours of terror before her death. The final 2 gunshots were, in their words, an execution. And the jury listened. Carefully. Grimly. 4 days, the courtroom reviewed autopsy reports, forensic evidence, crime scene photos. Each piece another heavy weight on the scales of justice. The defense tried to offer another story, one of a man shaped by abuse, trauma, and mental instability. Wainwright's childhood was dragged into the open. Broken family structures, documented psychiatric struggles, a long history of incarceration that began when he was still a teenager. They argued he was more than just the sum of his worst acts. But for the jury it wasn't enough. The horror of Carmen's final moments outweighed any sympathy Wainwright's past might have earned. In May of 1995, a jury found Anthony Wainwright guilty on all counts. A month later, Circuit Judge Vernon Douglas delivered the sentence. It was a moment that brought a measure of legal closure but little comfort. Outside the courthouse, residents of Lake City and neighboring towns reacted with a mixture of relief and quiet grief. Newspaper headlines called it justice. Talk radio hosts debated whether the death penalty was swift enough. But for the Gayheart family, the sentence was just another milestone in a long, painful journey that had begun in a parking lot one afternoon and would stretch across decades. From the moment the sentence was read in that Hamilton County courtroom in June 1995, Anthony Wainwright began what would become a nearly 30-year wait on Florida's death row. He was transferred to Florida State Prison in Rayford, a place where condemned inmates live isolated from the world, where every day is shaped by routine, silence, and the distant inevitability of execution. For Wainwright, life reduced to a 6 by 9 foot cell behind thick steel doors, under the constant hum of fluorescent lights. Human contact was minimal. Recreation, when granted, happened in caged yards. Meals were delivered through a slot. And time, if it moved at all, moved slowly. Wainwright gave few public statements from prison. Unlike some inmates who wrote letters or gave interviews to the media, he remained largely silent. But court records and appeal briefs offer a window into what these decades were like. Multiple appeals were filed, each one a legal effort to postpone the sentence, to raise questions about the fairness of his trial, about his mental fitness, and about procedural errors. In 2011, Wainwright's legal team petitioned for a new sentencing hearing, citing ineffective assistance of counsel and newly uncovered mitigation evidence. That appeal was denied. In 2017, another challenge claimed evolving standards in death penalty jurisprudence should apply to his case. That too was rejected. Each time, the courts upheld his conviction and sentence. The Florida Supreme Court, reviewing his petitions over the years, repeatedly found that the evidence against Wainwright was overwhelming, and that no amount of personal history could offset the brutality of the crime. But still, the legal process continued. Appeals, post-conviction relief motions, and federal habeas corpus petitions, each filed with urgency, each dismissed in turn. Then came 2024. Nearly 3 decades after the murder of Carmen Gayheart, Florida's governor signed a death warrant. Wainwright's final appeal reached the state's highest court in early 2025, arguing mental decline, harsh confinement, and due process violations. But on May 10, 2025, the Florida Supreme Court issued its final denial. In its written opinion, the justices stated, "The record clearly supports that the jury's verdict and sentence were based on compelling and lawful evidence. The defendant has not demonstrated any constitutional infirmity that would justify further delay." With that ruling, all legal avenues were exhausted. There would be no more stays. No further reprieves. The path was now set. Anthony Wainwright would be executed by lethal injection on June 10, 2025. For nearly 30 years he had waited. Now that wait was over. And the final chapter of this case, one that began with an escape, unraveled into a tragedy, and stretched across courtrooms and prison cells, was about to close. As the calendar turned to May 2025, nearly 30 years after the violent death of Carmen Gayheart, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis signed the execution warrant for Anthony F. Wainwright. The date was set, June 10, 2025. It would be Florida's second execution of the year. For Wainwright, this marked the beginning of a final countdown, not measured in years or decades as before, but in days. Exactly 30, each one now carrying a sharpened weight of finality. Inside Florida State Prison, Wainwright's status changed. No longer a general death row inmate, he was placed on death watch, a heightened security protocol reserved for inmates within weeks of execution. His cell was moved just a short walk from the execution chamber. He was monitored 24 hours a day with every movement recorded. His access to visitors became more structured. Legal representatives came more frequently, pressing forward with last-minute motions, hoping for a stay that so far had not come. Spiritual advisors were also granted access during these final weeks. It's unclear whether Wainwright accepted pastoral care, but records from similar cases show inmates often turn inward during this time, some seeking reconciliation, others maintaining silence. A request for clemency was filed, and his defense team again raised issues about his mental state, early trauma, and long-term solitary confinement. But as of early June, the courts had not intervened. The Florida Supreme Court, in its May 10 ruling, declined to halt the execution, stating clearly that no legal basis for delay had been found. What Wainwright thinks or feels now is known only to him. He has not issued a public statement. There have been no reported interviews or final words through attorneys. But preparations continue nonetheless. Prison officials rehearse the protocol. The lethal injection chamber is inspected. Witness lists are finalized, and the execution team, trained for precision and emotional detachment, stands by. If Wainwright has submitted a final meal request, it has not yet been released to the public. Florida traditionally grants this request on the day of execution, provided the food is available from the prison kitchen and the cost does not exceed $40. What he will choose, if anything, remains to be seen. As June 10th nears, the weight of the moment builds. For some, it's the long-promised conclusion of a brutal crime. For others, it's a reminder of a justice system that continues to wield capital punishment. And for Anthony Wainwright, it is the slow approach of an end he has lived under since 1995, now just days away. As we fade to black, we remember Carmen Gayheart not for how her life ended, but for the life that was stolen far too soon. In loving memory of Carmen Gayheart, 1971 to 1994. Thank you for watching. If you found this story impactful, please like, share, and subscribe for more in-depth true crime documentaries. Your support helps us continue bringing these real stories to light.